Hi everybody, and welcome to week 5, lecture part 1, Ancient Greece through the Archaic period. Chapter 5 continues our journey through early Western civilizations. This particular civilization, ancient Greece, is not quite so old as Mesopotamian, Egyptian, or Aegean cultures. In fact, it shares geography with the Aegean cultures of chapter 4. But as we move forward in time from chapter 4, we see a major shift in the development of Helladic or Greek culture. After the Mycenaean Age, which you will recall was the latest of the Aegean cultures to flourish in chapter 4, Greece underwent a backslide in economic and cultural developments. This time period from roughly 1100 to 1000 BCE is often called the Greek Dark Age. Due to migration into Greece of the Dorians and other peoples, and the ensuing wars that appear to have followed, poverty ensued. The Greek Dark Age saw the temporary disappearance of writing, as well as architectural and artistic developments that we saw in chapter 4. But by the Proto-Geometric period, about 1050 to 900 BCE, economic stabilization returned to the region. This jump-started population growth in Greece and prompted an urbanization of the area. This period sees the rise of the polis, or city-state. Poleis became city centers that supported the arts like pottery, sculpture, and architecture. It's in the Proto-Geometric period, then, that the arts begin to flourish once more. The term Proto-Geometric, as with all period names of ancient Greece as the terms are used today, specifically refers to the art style of time. The term geometric is a reference to the style of decoration specifically found on pottery and ceramic sculptures that date before 700 BCE. The decorations on the proto-geometric works on the screen utilize spirals, bands, diamonds, and triangles, Greek keys, and other regular and geometrically shaped motifs. The proto-geometric faces you're seeing, as well as the centaur figure, are painted with a brownish-red slip and a buff or plain surface underneath. This reminds many art historians of Neolithic pottery decoration elsewhere. Since decoration has an old-fashioned appearance compared to, say, Minoan or Mycenaean art, proto-geometric and geometric period art are held up as evidence by some of the backslide attributed to the Dark Age. Yet the body style of the pots is indeed heavily influenced by Aegean pottery, especially Minoan pottery, in their placement of handles and general shapes. Proto-geometric potters actually seem to improve upon Aegean methods. By the proto-geometric period, artists are using the potter's wheel, and so many of their vessels have a taller profile. In ancient times, Greece was not the unified nation it is today. It wouldn't become an empire until the classical era. Instead, Greece was a grouping of major poleis who were frequently jockeying for power and at war with one another. Still, residents of the area that we call Greece were unified in a number of ways. They shared a common basic language, cultural elements such as art styles, as well as religious beliefs. Like many other civilizations, ancient Greece was a polytheistic culture, which believed in many gods and goddesses, several of whom we'll see depicted in art of this module. You can read about the most important of them on page 104 of your textbook. The geometric period was a highly important time. It was the era when we have the formation of several traditional elements of Greek culture. For one, it's in the geometric period that the first Olympic Games are held. The geometric period is also believed to be the time of Homer, the epic poet who's credited by most people with codifying the Iliad and the Odyssey. While the two stories appear to have been around for some time, passed down through oral history for hundreds of years, it was Homer in the 8th century who first brought the disparate elements of the tales and formed an orthodox version of the story of the Trojan War. It's Homer's version of these ancient stories, which predated him by hundreds of years, that people follow even today. The events of the Iliad and the Odyssey turn up repeatedly in narratives on artworks great and small. Their importance in the minds of the ancient Greeks is as great, if not greater, than the many other archetypical battles that make up the backbone of Greek culture. The pottery for which the geometric is named differs somewhat in style from the pottery or ceramics of the proto-geometric period. Like proto-geometric forms, geometric style includes simplification or abstraction of form, geometric rather than organic shapes, and monochromatic compositions. Yet geometric period pottery has developed a narrative element not present in proto-geometric art. The few pieces that remain from the geometric period are funerary vases. Athens appears to have been the main Greek center for geometric pottery, with the style spreading from there throughout the region through trade. Two pieces, known as the dipylon amphora and the dipylon crater, seen on the screen, are so named for their proximity to the dipylon cemetery when found. Like other geometric style pieces, they're believed to be examples of funerary pottery. Although during this period most bodies were incinerated, these vessels did not contain human remains most of the time, like the urns people use today. Instead, they held libations, poured out by mourners. The dipylon amphora and crater are believed to have been created in the same workshop that served aristocratic or wealthy families. Both vases are shapes that are very common in the pottery of ancient Greece. You can see standard shapes of Greek vessels in page 117 of your book. Let's see if I can find a copy of it here real quick. Here we go. So here's our amphora, which is a wide-bodied vessel with two handles and a narrower lip, right? And then we've got our crater. The crater has a wide mouth as well as a body. Vase shapes have typical purposes that they serve. An amphora, for example, like this one, would generally be a storage vessel for short-term or long-term. A crater, on the other hand, with its wide mouth, would not be good for storage because stuff would get into it or come out of it, but instead it would be used to mix liquids together, like water and wine, the most popular beverage in ancient Greece. Here, however, these vessel shapes are chosen more for symbolic and aesthetic reasons. Both the dipylon amphora and crater depict funerary scenes that both display the purpose of the vase as well as provide us with information about funerary rites of the time. We know that since Mycenaean times, burning of the deceased body was popular as a funerary method, and this act is depicted in the bands of decoration on both of the vases. Oops. The dipylon amphora at first, from afar, appears to just contain row after row of dense and beautiful geometric decoration. But when you look closer, you can see that the band in the center, between the handles, contains a scene. A detail of that scene is on the screen. The scene contains a number of mourners depicted with triangular silhouetted bodies, filling a register in a way very similar to the narrative art of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Some figures have legs, others have long skirts. This seems to be the main form of gender differentiation used. They put their hands to their head in consternation. In the center of the mourners is a platform that holds a body. It is difficult to tell if the body is supposed to be male or female. The platform resembles a funerary bier used in ancient Greece upon which a body might be incinerated. Above and surrounding the body is a strange checkerboard pattern that some say represents the idea of smoke or fire rising from the body. The dipylon crater depicts a similar scene and more. Once again, the main band between the handles shows a funerary scene, with a body apparently alight and a checkerboard of smoke or fire rising from it. The mourners are handled slightly differently. Instead of just placing hands on the head, they actually grasp at their hair, as you can see a little better here. The gender differentiation is more subtle, with hatch marks indications of breasts, like here and here, being the only indication of difference between men and women. The head is filled with a large eye-like shape. Animals appear below the bier, but their legs appear either broken or folded, indicating they are sacrifices meant to help the deceased moved into the afterlife. Below the main band is another band, with images often found on other late geometric period vases. These scenes appear to depict funerary processions or games, with horses drawing chariots and warriors carrying figure-8 shaped shields. Such funerary rites are described in the Iliad, as Hector is laid to rest at the end of the poem. Like most of our ancient cultures, our earliest art is funerary in nature. Perhaps it has something to do with better preservation of objects placed away from the public in burials or cemeteries. On the other hand, we've seen that some of our ancient civilizations are so obsessed with life that they want to transition to another life upon death. Most Greeks would not have believed that it was possible to achieve a happy afterlife, as only the greatest individuals could entertain such hopes. However, another important drive behind funerary art is the desire to be remembered and to remember the dead. This impetus will continue to influence art throughout Greece's history. While the geometric style is associated with Athens, the Orientalizing period is associated with the portal city of Corinth. Throughout art history everywhere, port cities are known for their more cosmopolitan attitudes and art styles. Trade conducted through ports leads to the introduction of style elements considered to be foreign and exotic to the culture in which they're imported. Corinth, during the Orientalizing period of 700 to 625 BCE, is no different. It seems that Corinthian artists, especially pottery painters, benefited from the import of designs from the East, meaning of the term Oriental, specifically from Mesopotamia, Anatolia or Turkey, and Egypt. Motifs of fantastic beasts, such as griffins and sphinxes, appear, decorating Orientalizing period pottery. Heraldic lions, reminiscent of the Ishtar Gate of Week 2, fill the upper register of the Olpe picture that you're seeing on the screen, while invented beasts pose heraldically below it. A sphinx sits in the upper register of this Olpe. You can see the sphinx right there. Notice that the decoration is less dense, more open, and follows some interesting style guidelines that will continue to be important in Greek art. Figures on the image on the surface are incised, and then the incisions are filled with slip, which is a mixture of pigment and clay and water. This slip paint is then fired, during which it turns black and glossy. This method of decoration is known as black figure, a technique discussed along with the later red figure on page 118. The background, although it appears very light, is the natural color of the fired clay. See that here and here. Red slip is sometimes used as well, and white paint is also added to the decorations after the firing process. One last example of the Orientalizing style pottery is the piece known as the Eleusis Amphora, which you can see here. This piece is extraordinary for its narrative decoration, especially because it depicts easily identifiable and specific scenes from Greek mythology, and is believed to be the earliest surviving vase to do so. Figures in Orientalizing period art, you can see, are treated more realistically and with more detail than they were in the geometric period, when all was stylized and abstract. In the upper portions between the ornately carved handles is a scene from the Odyssey, in which Odysseus and his men trick the giant Cyclops Polyphemus, who has held them captive, and spear him through his single eye. See the spear here? Polyphemus and his eye. There's Odysseus and one of his men. On the body of the vase, we have a scene from the story of Perseus, who, among many other deeds, decapitated the Gorgon Medusa. In the image on the screen, you are seeing the two monstrous Gorgons who are chasing Perseus, who's escaping. You can see his leg here. He escapes. The obverse of the vase, which you can see here, displays Medusa's headless body, almost as if we're seeing it from above. Archaic period, 625 to 480 BCE. The Archaic period is so called because earlier art historians felt that while art from this period anticipates the classical period, it's still old-fashioned or antiquated in comparison, which is what archaic tends to mean. While this notion is now itself perhaps ironically outdated, this term is still used widely in art history for purposes of continuity and convenience. In fact, Archaic period art is one of significant developments. The era also yields a lot of very beautiful and interesting architecture, life-size sculpture, and highly sophisticated pottery decoration. In earlier times, Greek people tended to worship in outdoor sanctuaries or with the aid of structures made of mud brick or wood, which have now been lost. In the Archaic period, architects began building such religious structures and other important public buildings out of masonry or stone. Cut stone, like that we saw in ancient Egypt, was used for monumental architecture like temples. However, while Egyptian architects used limestone and granite, Greek architects used marble. Greek temples and other monumental architecture was usually based on the post and lintel system that we've seen earlier. As in Egypt, such temples were part of larger districts called sanctuaries where public performances and processionals or parades were held. In the Archaic period, temples take on a layout that will serve Greek architects throughout the later Classical and Hellenistic ages. These temples were probably based on earlier models made in mud brick and timber. The Temple of Artemis at Corcyra is a terrific early example of an archaic structure. On the screen you can see an excellent illustration of the facade of the temple. The entry is supported by a number of tall columns, which hold up a rectangular entablature. The entablature of Corcyra is relatively plain, but you will see other architects fill it with decoration. Above this entablature, you see a triangular support called a pediment. The pediment served as a gable or pointed support for a pitched A-frame roof, which throughout Greece's ancient history would be roofed in timber and thatch. The pediment here, as in later temples, provides a service for narrative sculptural decoration. At Corcyra, the sculpture's in relief. The shapes are carved out of a background slab. In other pediments, the sculptures are fully in the round and placed within the pediment space. The central figure is Medusa, whom we've already met, who sticks her tongue out in a frightening gesture to the viewer. She is surrounded by her children, Pegasus on the left and Chrysaor on the right, flanked by her heraldically posed lions and warrior figures. Notice how the artist arranges the figures to make the most out of the pediment space. As the pitched roof, gabled temple will remain the constant template for future temples, we can see how different artists have treated this challenging space over the centuries. Notice that unlike ziggurats, rock-cut tombs, or pyramids, temples are not necessarily good examples of sacred mountains. In fact, they are often treated as secreted, sacred places, more like caves than mountains. Yet also remember that a lot of important temples actually sit atop hills that overlook the city or landscape, and therefore may function in a similar way. The Temple of Artemis is an example of what we will call the Doric order. An order in Greek architecture is something like the Egyptian canon. It's a set of rules that govern how to go about setting up the most perfectly proportioned structure. On the screen you can see an illustration of the three main Greek orders. You can also see this on page 110 of your textbook, where the authors provide an explanation of the differences between the orders. Doric is the oldest of the three orders and has the features found in the Temple of Artemis, as well as archaic temples of Hera and of Phaia that we're going to be seeing. Notice that the Greek orders differ not just in their ratio or proportions or height, but also in the decoration of their columns, capitals, and entablatures. Doric and Ionic orders differ most recognizably in their capital style. But you can see that there are differences in other elements as well. It's not inappropriate to think about Greek orders in the same way we think about the Egyptian canon. Orders were, like the Egyptian canon, considered to be the height of perfection, and as such should be followed by all architects. The main difference here is that the Greek orders fell in and out of favor over time, while the Egyptian canon remained the same for thousands of years. This is a major philosophical difference in the arts of Greece and Egypt. Greek art, as your book notes, is rarely static in style. Once one style is established as orthodox or ideal, it soon will fall out of favor, and another one will follow soon to take its place. While you are not required to know by heart all of the architectural terms mentioned in your book and in the illustration, you should become familiar with most of them, and a few of them absolutely must become part of your vocabulary. For example, in the plan and the photo of Temple of Hera I at Poseidonia, the main feature of the structure is its peristyle. A peristyle is a colonnade, which is a row of columns, that surrounds the perimeter of the structure. Remember that the word fragment style refers to columns, as in the term hypostyle, which we learned means hall of columns in week 3. So the peristyle is the colonnade, the row of columns that goes all the way around the perimeter. You can see it here, and then you can also see it here. The naos, or cella, refers to the central enclosed room of the structure. The entire structure sits atop a stylobate, which is a platform atop the steps to the temple. So here's the stylobate, and there's the stylobate. Platform atop the steps, stylobate. It serves as the temple floor. The entablature, which we've already encountered at Corcyra, is made up of several parts. The architrave, its base, the frieze, the main section used for decoration, and the cornice, which is the upper portion that projects out and supports the roof, but that is missing here. So let's take a look at our illustration. Architrave, right? Frieze, right? And cornice projects out to support the roof. As at Hera 1, Doric order structure often have fluted columns, which means that the columns have vertical channels carved into their curved surface. You can see that here, even though it's quite worn away, that this is true at Hera 1. Fluted columns. In the photo of Aphea, you can see the typical Doric frieze decoration of alternating triglyphs, which is the 3-part decoration that you see here, alternating with metopes, which are the panels in between them, that might be plain, as here, or filled with painted or sculpted decoration. The Siphnian treasury at the Delphi sanctuary displays a carved frieze with scenes from the epic mythological battle of the gods and the Titans. In this illustration of the treasury, you can see that these structures would have at one time been brightly painted. This is sometimes difficult to remember, as we often aesthetically appreciate the clean lines and beautiful surface luster of stone like marble. The illustration also displays another architecture feature, the caryatid. A caryatid is any support, such as a column, that has been carved into the shape of a human. Here we see 2 female caryatids, as is typical. In addition to being an excellent example of the Doric order, the Temple of Aphea on the island of Aegina is also a great example of the archaic use of sculptural decoration in temples. The hilltop temple was dedicated to a local goddess. You can see a reconstruction drawing here, the Temple of Aphea. Like many such temples, the focus was on the exterior, for only a few people could actually go inside. The exterior was full of exquisite decoration, though only parts of the pediments, remember those triangular forms, exist today. You can see here that they're completely gone. On the screen, you can see a photo of the sculptures that once filled the west pediment of the temple. Athena, in the center, leads local Aegean warriors to a battle of Troy. The various warriors fall and pose in ways that are pretty naturalistic, but that also, take advantage of the triangular shape of the pediment. You can imagine this triangular shape of the pediment here. The central figure stands straight, while other figures crouch to shoot arrows or fall dying. We have 2 dying warriors that are illustrated. These warriors pose in pretty naturalistic ways, and we can see that the artist is more concerned with the natural or realistic appearance of the human being than they used to be in the geometric period. This growing interest in realism will continue into the classic period. Yet when we see the warriors' faces, we can detect a bit of a smile. This expression, called the archaic smile, which you can see in this figure as well, right, is one very identifiable characteristic of the archaic period. In a time where naturalism is more highly valued, some stylized elements like the archaic smile are still preferred. An illustration here of one of the archers reminds us of the bright, non-naturalistic colors used for the polychrome of these sculptures, and it would make them easier to see from ground level, and also give them a more lively and vibrant appearance. The most abundant freestanding sculpture in the archaic period, though, are the kuroi and korei, representing perhaps ancestors, priests or priestesses, or even athletes. These sculptures were intended, according to inscriptions, to commemorate loved ones or important events. They often seem to have functioned as funerary sculpture, like grave markers, but they have also been found in sanctuaries where they served purposes unknown. Korei, which is plural of kori, which means girl, were always clothed, while kuroi, plural of kuros, which means boy, almost never were. This has led some to believe that they serve different functions. Kuroi and korei are found throughout the archaic period, and though they undergo some artistic changes over those 140 years, their general formats appear to have remained the same. So we have a few examples of images that typify the kuroi style. They're all nude, boys, and probably intended to look larger than life size. They step forward with one foot in a relatively stiff motion. Their fists are balled up at their sides, and they stand straight and look forward. Their hair falls in simplified ringlets or braids. See that here. And their faces have wide eyes with simplified facial features like half-circle eyebrows. They exhibit the archaic smile most of the time. Here's one really good example. This pose reminds us of those standing statues of ancient Egypt, especially depictions of the pharaohs. One thing, even though this kuros and this kuros are missing their lower legs, can you still tell that they have one foot forward? Yes, you still can. By the way the shadows fall and the light falls in the photograph, you can tell that the one knee, usually the left one, is in front of the right. See that there and there. Korei, the female figures, differ a little more from sculpture to sculpture. Each korei is clothed, but the clothes often varies, as can the style of hair. See that here with the Berlin korei. The poses of the korei also differ. The Berlin korei is fairly typical in that she's offering something to the viewer, perhaps a pomegranate. Other korei, like the Paplos korei or the Chios korei, there you go, Chios korei, also appear to have at one time had a forearm that stretched outward. See that here. In the korei, evidence that pigment once adorned them is more obvious. The figure's eyes, hair, and clothing often have red-colored stains, indicating the presence of pigment or adhesive clay. While the artists do not display much of the body, certain techniques allow them to demonstrate their knowledge of anatomy. The Paplos korei and the Berlin korei are monumental, their bodies taking on the appearance of imposing columns. Very column-like here and here. By the time the artist of the Chios korei sculpted this piece, right, here we go, Chios korei. However, artists started to begin to use what historians call the wet drapery technique. The clothing may cover the body, yes, but it also reveals it by clinging to the form. In the classical period, artists will use the wet drapery technique more and more frequently to avoid breaking the convention that required images of females to remain clothed. You may well ask, why are korei clothed and kuroi nude? Well, we now know that in ancient civilizations, conventions of modesty often prevented women from dressing as they might like in public. As we've seen, art often reflects these trends. While there are small-scale images of nude women in Greek art, in pornographic pottery for example, there are no large-scale sculptures of nude women until the late classic period. Conventions restricting women's movements and activities were perhaps surprisingly strict in ancient Greece. We'll discuss some of those common misconceptions in this section on classical Greece. As in the geometric and orientalizing periods, the Archaic period produced a distinctive style of decoration and pottery. Not surprisingly, narrative imagery, especially of mythological and Homeric scenes, gained in popularity. Vase painters were concentrated mostly in Athens during the Archaic period. Athenian potters and vase painters often both signed their artworks and were considered equals in skill and creativity. Other times, we're unsure of the name of the artist, but we can detect a style pattern. In such cases, an artist may be known as the Amasis painter, for example. Vase painters continue to use black figure decoration, as in the Dionysus with Maenads and Achilles and Ajax playing a game. You can see here. In the Archaic period, they added another technique to their repertoire, red figure decoration. In the red figure technique, the process is reversed. The negative shapes of the background, right, are painted with the black slip, like you can see here, while the positive shapes, or the figures, are left in the buff color of the red fired clay. You can see another good example of red figure decoration here. Another major innovation occurs in the composition of the paintings. In the Archaic period, instead of limiting the narrative to bands or registers of decoration, vase painters take advantage of the entire belly of the vase. For example, in Dionysus with the Maenads, the entire vase belly forms the space for the figures. Similarly, in Ajax and Achilles playing a game, which you can see here, that takes up a large portion of the vase and the figures fill the space. In the detail of Achilles and Ajax, a quiet scene from the Iliad, notice the intricacy in which the artist has incised the patterns on the figures' clothes. Hair and beards, really tiny. In Dionysus, also notice that the artist has left the female figure's skin buff the color of the clay instead of filling them with black slip. Oh, right here, right? So you see the female figures are buff, color of the clay, instead of black like Dionysus. This is gender differentiation, just as we've seen in Minoan and Egyptian art, but with the use of value, light and dark, instead of color. You may also notice how often the artists include text to identify the figures on the vases, to allow the viewer to more easily recognize the mythological subject. So for example, here we have Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons, and Achilles. And here, Penthesilea, not only is she left the color of the vase, but then she's been painted with white paint. You can read more about the death of Sarpedon, this scene from the Iliad that's featured in your book on page 118.